GoSoutheastern.com.
Exclusive.
Welcome to another edition of The Total Athlete with Ed Furst, here on exclusive on GoSoutheastern.com. This is a biweekly feature we're doing. Last week we visited about the perception of student athletes in the public eye. The student athletes function as a role model, their public image, and that effect on personal and team performance. We're going to shift now the focus on this week's edition to the private self and how that can affect peak performing. I'd like to introduce our guest and star of the show, Ed Furst. He's a licensed marriage and family counselor, a licensed professional counselor, and a certified sports counselor, and he's volunteering his time from the Southeastern Student Support Services. Ed, appreciate you being here.
It's good to be here.
Very good. Well, we do want to get a disclaimer in. I want to be clear that this discussion is purely educational in nature, not a substitute for counseling, and we encourage anyone who wants to talk about their personal emotions to seek professional help. Well, let's get started, Ed. Let's talk first about this idea of the private self, and student athletes and athletes face inner demons that affect performance. Let's talk about a couple of those. Give us a few examples of some inner demons that student athletes face.
Okay, Luke. Certainly there's a lot of demons that athletes face on the inside that they don't always get to talk about, but we're going to talk about three that affect the athlete's psyche and their ability to perform. The first three that come to my mind that I want to talk about today are, one is called obsessive compulsive thoughts, the other one is anger, and the other one is fear and anxiety. And when I talk about obsessive compulsive thoughts, what I'm talking about is when an athlete perseveres on something that's happened in the past, begins to obsess on it, or even perseveres so much that the athlete starts worrying about what might happen in the future. And certainly what that does is that compromises the athlete's ability to focus on whatever the task is out there on the field or the court, whatever that task is that athlete's trying to accomplish. The second one is anger, and there's two parts to that. I think of kind of internalized anger and externalized frustrations, but those typically stem from the difference between the athlete's what we call the ideal self, which is the way the athlete really wants to perform out there, and the real self, which is actually how the athlete tends to perform more on a day-by-day average type of basis. In other words, if there's too big of a gap between what the athlete is idealizing, the ideal self, and how the athlete actually performs, then the athlete's going to be really frustrated. And then the third one is fear and anxiety, and really the key phrase surrounding that is what ifing. A lot of athletes begin to what if, and they say, what if I can't, perform well? What if I fail? What if I make the same mistake I made last? What if I don't complete that pass? But whatever it is, what happens with the what ifing is the athlete is projecting into the future something that hasn't happened yet, and of course the athlete can't then focus on what the athlete needs to do right now.
We always try to use some real-world examples to illustrate these points. We're pulling ours today from the world of tennis. Recently, Nadal has stated that while Federer used to have his number, he's come out in the media and actually said, particularly after this past U.S. Open, that Djokovic simply has his number, and he's got a mental block to beat Djokovic. He just seems to, quote, have his number. So there's an example of that fear and anxiety and how it's affecting his play, because Djokovic has had a very dominant year.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I think one of the things that happens, and when you've got a great athlete like Nadal, who certainly has the skill and the ability, one of the things we have to keep in mind whenever we're talking about sports is that everything that's important happens in the now. And so there's kind of four observable behaviors that I think that coaches need to be looking for. And even athletes that kind of stand out when you can tell that an athlete's suffering with an inner demon that's kind of got them distracted. One is zoning out, and that's when the athlete's internally preoccupied, maybe from a past action that they weren't satisfied with, just happened recently. Another one is rubbernecking, and that's when the athlete is so focused on getting approval from the coach that every time the athlete does something, the athlete looks over at the coach to try to get some approval or some kind of reaction, and that again can compromise the athlete's focus. And then pressing, which is the deal about pressing is a lot of times athletes try to, we all have a part of us where we want to be a hero, and sometimes instead of the athlete letting the game come to him or come to her, the athlete will try to force something that's really not there. And then the last one is tentativeness, and this is where we see athletes sometimes doing the opposite of pressing. They start to play not to lose or not to make a mistake, and this usually stems from either a lack of confidence or a lack of competence, and those are a little bit different. Confidence goes to the nature of that internal sense of feeling comfortable and feeling poised about oneself, and competence has to do with the ability to carry out a skill.
Now, sometimes an athlete knows that they are being plagued by these inner demons. Sometimes they're unaware of them, but sometimes they realize that they've got these things to overcome, and yet those issues still go unresolved. Why is that, Ed?
Yeah, and that's a really good question, Luke. And actually, you'd think it's something that we would deal with on a regular basis, but it actually is avoided quite a bit. It's really quite simple. A lot of athletes have a fear of telling the coach what's really going on inside because they don't want to be perceived as weak. They don't want to be vulnerable in that way. And they don't necessarily know what the coach is going to do with that information. You know, is that information going to be used against them, or is that going to be an opportunity for the athlete to learn about that? And that's just not a risk that a lot of athletes are willing to take. Another one is the fear of vulnerability as far as teammates. You know, if two teammates are competing for the same job and one athlete has some fear and some doubt about a particular skill or how they're doing, they don't want to share that with their teammate because they're competing for playing time and for the same position, and they don't want to give that teammate an edge, even though they're on the same team. And then the last one that's unfortunate is you would hope athletes could find some kind of a safe person to talk to, even if it's not a coach or a teammate. Is there some safe mentor out there where they could talk about, process, and heal what's going on inside, because otherwise it just stays inside and it festers and they don't get a chance to overcome that fear.
It seems like that's the first step of action. If somebody is dealing with any of these issues, that's step number one is finding someone that they can trust.
That's exactly right, Luke, yes.
All right, this has been another edition of The Total Athlete. I'd like to thank Ed Furst for joining us here today. It's a biweekly feature here on GoSoutheastern.com, exclusive, and we appreciate you logging on and checking us out. Remember, for the very latest in Southeastern athletics, visit GoSoutheastern.com. For Ed Furst, I'm Luke Willman. Have a great week.